You're like, well, yeah, but not covered under warranty. It's our fault, but we're not going to cover it because we messed up or didn't replace this gasket. So I was like, well, it's just a gasket, right? How much is that going to cost? Roughly $400. Hello everybody, today I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about my experience with the Mk6 GTI timing chain tensioner failure. So as you guys may know, if you've watched this channel for any amount of time, I own a white Mk6 Volkswagen GTI. The Mk6 Volkswagen GTIs contain the first generation TSI engine. It's a 2-liter turbocharged overhead cam. It's a great engine. It has some major downfalls though. There's a lot of issues with it from the factory, and especially in the early years before they started addressing them. Chief amongst them being the timing chain tensioner. The timing chain tensioners in these like to lose tension over time, and as a result of that, your timing chain will eventually stretch or completely be disconnected from the gears and cause your engine to grenade itself. The first generation TSI engines are considered interference engines, which means that when the engine is out of time, the pistons will actually smash into the intake and exhaust valves and cause damage to both the top and bottom end of the engine, making your engine a very expensive paperweight. For those of you who don't know what I'm talking about when it comes to timing with an engine, timing is basically just the synchronization with the crankshaft and the camshafts, so that when they're in time, the engine runs normally, and when they're out of time a little bit, it'll run pretty poorly, and when they're really out of time, the pistons will make contact with the valves, and then, metal on metal, spinning at a high RPM, you get the picture. So it all started one day when I was doing work on a friend's car. I think I was replacing a ground strap in his Civic. And while I was at the garage and doing work and I had all my tools out, I was like, I'm gonna redo the spark plugs in my GTI because I hadn't changed them yet. And I was like, okay, it's a good idea to change these now. I had them sitting on the shelf for several months, and I figured that was a good time. So I put them in and I went to start the car, and it hesitated to start. And I was like, okay, maybe they're not gapped correctly. They came pre-gapped, so I didn't check them, which is something you should always do. I didn't check them, so I thought maybe the gap was a little bit off. So I took the spark plugs out and I checked the gaps on them, and they were all perfectly fine. So started it back up, and same issue. So I was like, okay, maybe they're bad. So I don't feel like messing with it tonight. I'll just put the old spark plugs back in. So I checked the gap on the old ones. They were fine. There really wasn't anything wrong with the old ones. Just doing routine maintenance. Checked the gap on them. They were all fine. Put them back in, and same issue. So I thought maybe it was an issue with my tune. So I took my tune off of it with the cob access port. Same issue, even worse. So I was like, okay, something's not right here. So at this point, I had a check engine light. I scanned it, and there was a number of codes, and I like to research things, especially I like to know pretty much everything there is to know about the cars that I own, and I knew right off the bat that was indication of the timing chain tensioner. So I was like, okay, I'm not going to mess with it. I don't want to damage anything. This is right at the end of fall, so things were starting to get cold here in Pennsylvania. So I was like, okay, just taking it to the dealership and they can deal with it. Because for those of you who aren't familiar with the Mk6 GTI community, the timing chain tensioner is a somewhat coveted failure that happens to the ignorant owners of these cars, where everybody thinks, oh great, my timing chain tensioner failed, brand new engine. That's not always the case. That was the case at one point. It's not really the case anymore. The timing chain tensioner issue with the first gen TSIs really only existed in the 2010s, the 2011s, and the 2012s, and I think at some point in 2013 they fixed it. And mine, of course, being a 2011, mine's right in the sweet spot there. before they put in the revised tensioner. So there is actually a warranty on this because it's a faulty part from the factory, and they can fail as soon as 10,000 miles, which is absolutely fantastic that your engine would grenade after 10,000 miles. Mine, I believe, had around 80,000 miles when the chain tensioner failed, and mine fit right in the bracket of 40% coverage on an engine replacement or 100% coverage of just the tensioner replacement, depending on if the valves were damaged. So I live kind of in the middle of nowhere, and the closest Volkswagen dealership is about 45 minutes away from me. And the closest tow truck company that was willing to tow my car from where I lived to the Volkswagen dealership was about 45 minutes in the other direction. So it would be about a 3-hour round trip for them, which is fantastic. So I called them on a Thursday, and they said they'd come around 3 p.m. And I'm like, okay, cool. 3 p.m. comes, no tow truck. 4 p.m. comes, still no tow truck. So I call them, and they're like, yeah, we'll be sending somebody as soon as possible, like next couple minutes we'll send somebody. All right. 5 p.m. rolls around, and I'm supposed to eat dinner with my parents. So I'm like, okay. I go over to my parents' house, which is about 10 minutes away from where I live, and we're eating dinner, and it is now about 6:30, and middle of dinner, I get a phone call, and it's the tow truck company. I'm like, sorry, gotta step out. I'll be back in half hour. So I get there, and I specifically said on the phone that the car was not running, which, I mean, it would start and it would run like garbage, but I didn't want to risk running it to the point where if it wasn't damaged, I don't want to run it anymore so that it will get damaged. So I get there, and it's a big flatbed, and the guy's like, that car is pretty low. I'm not going to be able to get it on my truck. And I'm like, I specifically requested to get a truck that, I mean, it's the stock ride height. It's not that low, but I mean, it's lower than like a normal car or like a truck or something. But he's like, I'm going to need you to drive it up on the bed. And I'm like, is there anybody else? And they're like, soonest we're going to be able to get someone to use the beginning of next week. And knowing the punctuality with this company already, from them stringing me along for 3+ hours, I'm like, okay, we'll drive it up on the bed. So it's go to start the car. It starts like garbage. It's running like garbage. Put it in a gear. Start moving a little bit, and it just stalls. And I'm like, okay, start it up again. Give it a little bit more gas. And I'm like burning up the clutch as it's struggling to get up on the flatbed. And finally get it halfway on there, and he's like, that's good. I'm like, great. There goes my clutch and my engine. So then get it on the flatbed. He takes it away. So the next day comes, which is a Friday, and the Volkswagen dealership calls me, and they're like, okay, we got your car. Everything's all good. Just know that regardless of what happens here, whether it's covered by warranty or not, we're going to have to charge you a $125 diagnostic fee just for looking at the car. And I'm like, well, I already know what's wrong with it. I had been dealing with this dealership since I got the car. And it's always every little thing. It's that $125 diagnostic fee. So I'm like, okay, fine, just look at the car. I already know that it's the timing chain tensioner. Just look at the car for yourself so you can see that it's the chain tensioner. So he's like, okay. Calls me a couple hours later. Yeah, it's the timing chain tensioner. All right, cool, replace it. Well, we need some more information from you. I'm like, oh boy. And they're like, okay, we need all of your oil change documentation saying that you changed your oil on time. I'm like, okay. I had one previous one done at that dealership. So they had that on record. And they're like, we need 7 oil changes from the last year. And because I had put a lot of miles on it since I owned it, because I love the car. So I'm like, okay, you have the 1, so we're down to 6. I had 2 of the oil changes done at one of the instant oil change locations near me, where you drive it up and they change your oil in like 15 minutes. But the one that I went to is about a half hour away from me in the other direction of the dealership, because there's nothing in my hometown, of course. So I had to drive out there, and I got the 2 proofs that I had the oil change done there with the mileage and everything. and I was able to get the documentation to the Volkswagen dealership shortly before they closed at 5 p.m. And they're like, well, we need 4 more. And I was like, well, I did them all myself. How am I supposed to prove that? So they're like, well, we're closing soon. We'll get back to you on Monday. I'm like, great. So this isn't going to be addressed until the beginning of next week at the earliest. So I'm like, whatever. So I drive home, and then the next Monday, a couple days later, they call me and they're like, yeah, we need that documentation. There's nothing we can do. So I'm like, how do I prove that I did the oil change myself? And they're like, receipts, bank statements, anything. Luckily, I had bought all of my oil change supplies under a commercial account, a local auto parts store, so that ended up not being an issue. So by Tuesday, I went up there, dropped off the documentation. They're like, great, we'll get back to you as soon as possible. Like, well, is the engine toast? Is it just the tensioner? We haven't even started looking at it yet, they said. Jeez. So the next day they call me and they're like, before we can start tearing into this, we need to verify that the aftermarket stuff done to your car didn't cause this issue. And I'm like, what reasonable aftermarket stuff could I do to the car that would cause the chain tensioner to fail? So they're like, well, I mean, we just need to verify it. It's just policy. So I'm like, okay, well, how do you verify it? They're like, well, the guy that usually does this for us is on vacation right now. And the nearest replacement for him is located in Sewickley, which is a suburb of Pittsburgh, which is about an hour away from my house and about 2 hours away from the dealership. And I'm like, well, get him up here. And they're like, well, he works full time at the Volkswagen dealership down there. As soon as we can get him is this weekend. So I'm like, whatever. Like, at this point, I'm not too happy because I still don't know whether or not I'm going to have to pay $4,000 out of pocket to get this engine replaced. So next weekend comes around. Of course, I don't hear anything because the Volkswagen dealership isn't open on the weekends. They just do service and they just kind of keep to themselves. So Monday rolls around and they're like, yeah, the aftermarket stuff you didn't damage the engine. We're good to move on. I'm like, fantastic. So 3 or 4 days later, they finally get to my car and they verify that the valves were not bent. They tear everything down. They verify that the valves were not bent and they just needed to replace the tensioner. So it was going to be covered completely by warranty, which is good. So they do that. I don't hear anything back from them for the rest of that week. So I've now been waiting for 2 weeks. Beginning of the next week, they're like, yep, come get your car. It's done. I'm like, okay, cool. So I drive over there, pay my $125 service fee, and I get in the car. I go to start it. It doesn't start. Well, it like doesn't even attempt to start. So I'm like, it seems like the battery. They probably left the lights on. So I go back in and I'm like, my car won't start. Did you guys leave the battery on? Like, can you give me a jump? They're like, oh yeah, we wrote that on the service paper. We accidentally left your lights on and killed your battery. So I'm like, cool. So he goes out and he gives me a start and the car starts and it sounds completely normal and I'm elated because my car isn't dead. So I let it idle for a couple minutes and then I drive around the block and everything feels fine. I come back into the dealership parking lot. I just shut it off to see if the battery is dead or just needed charge. Go to start it up again and doesn't, like, it cranks a little bit and then it stops cranking and all the dash lights like kind of flicker. I'm like, great, I need a new battery now. So I go back in, he jumps me again, and I drive to a local auto parts store and buy a new battery, which was close to $150. So I get the new battery in and I'm like, okay, we're done. This whole fiasco's over. Drive it home. The next day I start it and the engine bay is smoking a little bit. And it smells like oil. So I'm like, okay, that's weird. So I'm thinking, okay, maybe it's like normal, maybe some new seals need to break in or something. So I start backing out of the driveway and I see on the concrete where my car was parked under the right side of the engine bay, a huge oil spot. If you're not familiar with, that's right where the timing cover is. So I pop the hood and I just do a little quick visual inspection. And the upper timing cover is leaking pretty profusely. It's not spraying out or anything, but it's enough that I'm losing oil and it's causing it to smoke a little bit. So I call up the Volkswagen dealership and I'm like, yeah, my one timing cover's leaking. I literally just the other day had the timing chain tensioner replaced under warranty. Could you guys look at this? And they're like, well, $125 service fee. Like, okay, just look at it. So I take it in. I actually have them change my oil at the same time. So they got more of my money on top of that $125 service fee. So then they call me back, car's ready to get picked up. Great. So I go, they're like, yeah, the upper timing cover is not covered under warranty, so you're going to have to pay for that out of pocket. I'm like, didn't you just have that off? They're like, well, yeah, but not covered under warranty. It's our fault, but we're not going to cover it because we messed up or didn't replace this gasket. So I was like, well, it's just a gasket, right? How much is that going to cost? Roughly $400. So I tell them to shove it, and then I ended up getting it done by a friend for a fraction of that. And then luckily, I haven't had any issues with the car since then, but that was quite the fiasco. So yeah, this video is a little bit different than what I usually do. As always, be sure to follow me on Instagram. Be sure to like the video if you liked it, dislike it if you didn't, and if you're a first-time viewer, be sure to subscribe. I have lots of other cool content on my channel, and I will see you all next time.